Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin. Chapter 1. The Tree That Wept in Winter. It was on a frost-bound morning in late December when I first heard of the matter that would come to be known, among the few permitted to speak of it, as the affair of the Weeping Tree. A strange and brooding title, no doubt, but one that proved curiously apt as the dreadful mystery unfolded. I had risen early, stirred from uneasy sleep by the rattling wind against the window panes of Baker Street. London was draped in white, the snow fresh and clinging, and I found Holmes standing at the hearth, pipe in hand, his lean frame outlined by the flickering glow of the fire. He had been silent for nearly an hour, save for the occasional tap of the pipe stem against his teeth, and I, engrossed in the morning edition of the Times, was content to let him remain in his reverie. It was only when a sharp rap sounded at the door that he stirred. "Come in, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes called without turning his head. "And do bring our guest upstairs at once." "Guest?" I echoed, lowering the newspaper. Holmes gave a brief smile, then gestured toward the untouched third teacup on the tray. "Arrived 10 minutes ago, pacing outside the door since. Smells faintly of wood smoke and northern frost. Shoes well polished but worn at the edges, indicating pride without means. From the trace of pine needles on his coat and the stiff set of his shoulders, I would place him recently returned from a long journey to the countryside, possibly Cumberland. The man is in distress, but not the hysterical kind. Something older, something buried." At that moment, the door opened, and Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man of about 60, wrapped in a dark wool coat that hung loosely from his shoulders. His face was pale, drawn, and framed by graying whiskers that seemed recently neglected. A battered hat trembled in his gloved hands. "Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson," he said in a voice roughened by either cold or grief. "Forgive the intrusion. I didn't know where else to turn." "You did quite right, sir," Holmes said, gesturing to the chair by the fire. "Do sit. You have travelled far." "From Hurstcombe, in the Lake District. I came by train overnight." "Then perhaps begin with your name," said Holmes, "and the reason a tree in winter has driven a man of your evident intellect to seek out a consulting detective." The man blinked. "I did not mention the tree." "No," Holmes said calmly. "But you passed through the snowfall unshielded, your right shoulder still damp, and the scent on your coat is unmistakably resinous, not from a hearth, but from a living pine. There are few trees that weep sap in winter, and fewer still that people weep beneath. Please, Mr. Pendred," the man said hoarsely. "Harold Pendred. And it is not sap, Mr. Holmes. The tree weeps water, or something like it, every year on the same day." Holmes raised an eyebrow but did not speak. "It's not superstition," Pendred said quickly. "I'm not the type. I've taught natural philosophy at St. Colvin's College these past 30 years, but the thing I saw this year was not natural. It was not something I can explain." Watson leaned forward. "You say the tree weeps?" Pendred nodded. "In the orchard at Windmere Hall, my sister's estate, left to her late husband, the Baronet Sir Giles Armitage. He died 2 years ago. My niece Clara now resides there. The orchard holds a single ancient pine, older than the rest, standing apart, no matter the frost. Every year on December 19th at dusk, moisture begins to bead along its lower branches, but this year, the liquid, it was red." Watson started. Red, you say? Red, doctor, like blood, but thinner, with a faint odor, not unlike rusted iron. Holmes rose and went to the window, gazing out at the swirling snow. What did you do? I thought at first it might be a trick, sap reacting with some frost, or runoff from a nearby shed roof. But there is no structure nearby. And then I found the footprints. Holmes turned. Go on. Just beneath the tree, a single pair, bare feet. They stood still for nearly an hour, I could see from the deepening of the snow, and then they vanished, as if the figure had turned to mist. You saw no person, no one. And that night, Clara received a letter. A letter? Pendred reached into his coat and drew forth an envelope. It was torn at the top and browned at the edges, though the ink remained bold. Holmes took it with delicate fingers and studied the elegant cursive. I know what you buried. You think winter forgets, but trees remember. The note bore no signature, no watermark, no stamp. Only a faint scent, lavender, fading, and a smear of something dark across one corner. Watson frowned. Who could have written such a thing? Holmes's fingers tapped the edge of the envelope. Mr. Pendred, when was this letter received? December 19th, just after dusk. The same time the tree began to weep. Yes. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then I suggest, my dear Watson, that we exchange the comforts of Baker Street for the frozen grounds of Windermere Hall. It appears that a most curious confluence of natural and unnatural phenomena has begun to stir. A weeping tree, vanishing footprints. And now a letter sent by memory itself. Watson said nothing but felt the familiar prickle of anticipation, the crackling thrill that always preceded Holmes's immersion in some tangled riddle. Holmes turned to Pendred. Tell me, sir, has anyone died recently upon the grounds? Pendred hesitated. Not recently, no. But, yes. There was a girl, 15 years ago. She drowned in the orchard pond. They said it was an accident. Holmes smiled coldly. And yet the trees remember. Chapter 2. A Letter with No Sender. The following afternoon found Holmes and myself aboard the northbound express from Euston, bound for the chilly, wind-lashed region of Westmoreland. Our compartment was quiet, save for the intermittent rattle of the train and Holmes's soft humming, an old French lullaby, oddly incongruous against the bleak countryside, racing past the frost-covered windows. Pendred had remained reticent for much of the journey, his eyes fixed upon some fixed, invisible point in the distance, as if the orchard of Windermere Hall had lodged itself behind his eyelids and would not let go. Once or twice he stirred as though to speak, but Holmes, ever alert to such delicate shifts in temperament, waved him gently to silence. There are times, Watson, Holmes remarked, when the absence of speech reveals more than a confession ever could. Our friend is not concealing the fact out of malice, but because he does not yet know which of them matter. It is a fog common in grief and in guilt. Do you believe he is hiding something? I asked in a low voice. Holmes tilted his head, not consciously, but the mind, particularly one trained in logic, has a habit of misplacing what it cannot accept. A man may teach the principles of Newtonian order for decades and still be undone by a single act of chaos. It was late afternoon when we arrived at the rural station of Hurstcombe, where a coach from Windermere Hall awaited us, a dour, open-sided affair driven by a gaunt man with a beard that reached nearly to his collarbone. Pendred offered him a small nod, and we climbed aboard without ceremony. As we passed through the mist-laced lanes, the landscape grew eerily silent. Fields of brittle heather stretched in all directions, their edges crusted with hoarfrost. The occasional copse of pine trees loomed like watchful sentries, their branches bending beneath snow's invisible weight. Soon, the spires of Windmere Hall emerged, a gabled house of considerable age, half swallowed by ivy, its windows staring like the blind eyes of a forgotten monument. Clara Pendred received us in the entrance hall. She was a young woman of striking reserve, neither beautiful in the conventional sense nor lacking in presence. Her eyes, grey as slate, regarded Holmes with cool scrutiny, though she greeted him politely. "My uncle wrote to say you were coming," she said. "I'm grateful you made the journey." Holmes bowed lightly. "Curiosity is a powerful engine, Miss Pendred. It moves even the most sedentary machines. May we see the letter again?" She led us into the drawing room, where a fire struggled against the chill. From a small drawer in the escritoire, she retrieved the envelope and its contents, identical to the one Pendred had shown us, save for one difference. "This one," Holmes said, peering closer, "bears a wax seal." He broke it carefully. The interior of the envelope contained the same sentence. "I know what you buried. You think winter forgets, but trees remember." "No return address," Watson murmured. "No postmark either," Holmes added, meaning it was hand-delivered. Clara nodded. "It was found on the windowsill of the morning room just after dusk. The maid discovered it. She thought it had been blown there by the wind." Holmes examined the wax seal. A crude impression of an eye within a tree, clearly pressed with something handmade, perhaps a carved coin or button. "Have you ever seen this symbol before, Miss Pendred?" Holmes asked. She hesitated. "Yes. Once, in a book that belonged to Sir Giles. It was an old family volume on local legends. He kept it locked in a drawer, but I found it years ago, after his death. The page marked had the same symbol. I thought it nonsense." "Where is this book now?" She looked down. "I burned it 2 winters ago." There was a silence. Watson leaned forward. "Why burn it?" She did not lift her gaze. "Because of what it contained." Holmes pressed no further, but I could see that his interest had intensified. He turned instead to Pendred. "And the footprints? Have they been preserved?" Pendred nodded. "They're still there. The snow has not fallen since. I instructed the groundsman not to disturb the area." "Then let us see them." We crossed the great hall, our footsteps muffled by threadbare carpets, and emerged into the icy dusk. The wind had grown sharper, carrying with it the metallic scent of frost. The orchard lay behind the east wing of the estate, an uneven patch of land with 15 or so gnarled trees, their limbs bare and shivering against the sky. But one tree stood apart. It was taller, darker, and seemed far older than the others. The bark ran in spirals, as though twisted by wind or grief, and its roots bulged above the frozen earth like the knuckles of a buried giant. Holmes approached it slowly, his breath curling in clouds. "There," Pendred said, pointing. Just beneath the lowest boughs, a faint pattern was visible in the snow. 2 human footprints, bare and narrow, standing parallel as if someone had paused and simply vanished. Holmes crouched, pulling a lens from his coat. No scuff marks, no drag lines. The snow is pristine behind them. "Exactly," Pendred whispered. "That's what I don't understand." Holmes nodded to himself. The tree, the footprints, the letter, each connected by something older than logic. But there is always a logic, Watson, even in madness. He stood, brushing snow from his trousers. "I will need time to study this place. And silence. There is something in the air here. Not evil, perhaps, but forgotten." "And the red liquid?" I asked. Pendred pointed to the bark. There, at the lowest split in the trunk, a faint trail remained, brownish now, dried and darkened, but unmistakably the trace of a weeping wound. Holmes stared for a long moment, then turned abruptly. "Come, Watson. Miss Pendred, may I see Sir Giles's study?" "Yes," she said, and though her voice was steady, I caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. As we walked back to the house, Holmes whispered, "She's lying about the book, and something tells me this tree has been weeping longer than any of them care to admit." Chapter 3. The Study of Sir Giles Armitage. Sir Giles Armitage's study was a room carved from gloom. Though modest in size, it bore the unmistakable scent of long-withheld air and burnt paper. The curtains, drawn across narrow windows, filtered the late daylight into a dim, yellowish hue that gave the place a sepia tone, like the preserved image of a life long past. Holmes entered first, pausing in the threshold with a sharp inhalation, like a man tasting the atmosphere before speaking. "This room has not been truly used in some time," he said, "yet it has not been abandoned." He gestured to a thin film of dust on the desk, interrupted in several places, chiefly near the drawer handles and along the arm of the leather chair, worn smooth by habit. The desk itself was a dark, hulking thing, its drawers closed and locked. Clara stood at the door, her arms folded, watching Holmes with the stiffness of someone offering permission they did not truly wish to grant. "This room was my stepfather's retreat," she said. "He kept it private, even from my mother. After his death I aired it once, then locked it again." "And yet," Holmes said, tapping his finger against the sideboard, "someone has entered since, the print of a woman's hand, small, yours, perhaps." She hesitated. "I came once, last year. I found nothing of interest." Holmes did not respond directly. Instead, he withdrew a set of delicate tools from his coat and set to work at the center drawer. With precise efficiency, the lock yielded, and the drawer slid open to reveal its contents. Inside, resting upon a velvet-lined tray, was a small assortment of objects. A sealed envelope, marked to be opened only in the event of my unnatural death, a silver locket with initials etched into its surface. A. A brittle, faded photograph of 3 figures beside a large pine tree, Sir Giles, a woman with indistinct features, and a young child. And beneath them all, an embossed, leather-bound volume. Holmes removed the book first. Its cover bore no title, only the same symbol we had seen on the wax seal, an eye within a tree. Clara drew back a step, but I burned it. I swear I did. "Clearly someone replaced it," Holmes said, "or you did not destroy it as thoroughly as you believed." He opened it delicately. The pages inside were cramped with handwritten annotations, notes in the margin, lines underlined in dark ink, and occasionally a series of numbers or coordinates scrawled along the bottom. The content was strange, fragmented, a mixture of folklore and genealogy, detailing centuries-old incidents tied to the estate, trees weeping in winter, ancestral curses, a girl drowned in a pond beneath the orchard in 1803, another in 1851, then a gap, until the entry marked 1909, written in the hand we presumed to be Sir Giles's. "The tree weeps still. It is a record, not a curse. Memory carved into root and bark. I did what was required. But the land forgets nothing. Nor does she." "Who is she?" I asked. Clara looked pale. "I don't know. Sir Giles never spoke of these things. He was a cold man, but not superstitious. He valued bloodlines and legacy above all else." Holmes returned the book to the drawer and picked up the sealed envelope. He examined the seal, but made no move to open it. "We will respect his condition," For now, but only just. The photograph next caught his attention. He held it up to the light, studying it closely. "Tell me, Miss Pendred, do you know who the child is?" "No," she said quietly. "That's not me. And the woman? I've never seen her before." Watson leaned in. "But this appears to have been taken in the orchard." "Yes," Holmes said. "There's our tree in the background, unmistakable, which makes the photograph. Curious. This image predates Clara's birth, yet shows a woman she doesn't know standing beside her stepfather and a child unknown to her. Why keep such a thing hidden?" "Unless," I offered, "that child matters." Holmes pocketed the photograph. "Quite so. A hidden heir, perhaps, or a scandal long buried. Whatever it is, it ties back to the tree, and that is where the trail bends." There came a knock at the study door. It was the housekeeper, a thin, angular woman named Mrs. Barrow, her face creased by years of service and little joy. "Pardon, Miss Clara, but Mr. Holmes asked to be informed of anything strange. Something's gone missing." Holmes turned. "What has?" "The bell pull in the east corridor. It's been torn clean from the wall." Clara blinked. "But that wing hasn't been used in months." "I was dusting, miss. No one's been down there since Michaelmas. But the cord's gone, and there's a damp print, just one, beneath the window." Holmes's eyes lit at once. "Show me." We followed Mrs. Barrow into the east corridor, a narrow shuttered passage that smelled faintly of mildew and polish. She led us to a disused guest room where, indeed, the bell-pull cord had been ripped free. Holmes crouched by the window, brushing a finger across the floor. "A bare foot again," he said. "Same size as before." "But how could anyone get in?" I asked. "Surely no one walks barefoot in this weather." "They do," Holmes said, "if they wish to be seen without being heard, or if they are no longer constrained by the conditions of the living." A shiver ran through me, not from cold, but from the disquiet in Holmes's tone. He did not believe in ghosts, but there are times when even the logical mind brushes the hem of something not yet explained and must acknowledge its chill. We returned to the drawing room as dusk began to press against the windows. "I will need a map of the grounds," Holmes said, "and any letters Sir Giles received in the last 6 months before his death." Clara nodded slowly. Holmes glanced once more at the envelope marked "in the event of my unnatural death," then looked to me. "Watson, something tells me we are not merely facing a crime long buried, but one that was meant to remain so. Someone, alive or otherwise, intends to keep it that way." Chapter 4. The Gathering of Shadows. Tutu. The fire in the drawing room had dwindled to embers when Clara returned bearing a folded sheaf of aged parchment. She laid it on the table with an air of quiet reluctance, then withdrew to the window, her face half lost in the pale reflection of the snow-dimmed glass. "This," she said, "is the most recent map of Winmere's grounds. My stepfather had it drawn up shortly after inheriting the estate." Holmes unfurled the sheet with care, studying the fine inked lines. The orchard, the guest wing, the east pond. Ah, here we are. There's a copse of trees not far from the old greenhouse. "That area hasn't been used in years," Clara said without turning. "Nor has the greenhouse, I gather?" Holmes asked. "Number?" "The glass shattered one winter and was never replaced. It's just a shell now, ivy-covered and half-sunken." Holmes tapped the section with a gloved finger. "Then we'll begin there tomorrow. But tonight, I would like to speak with those still living within these walls. A house, Miss Pendred, is like a stage. And on a stage, every player has a part to perform. Even those who believe themselves mere observers. Clara hesitated. You mean the staff? Indeed. I'd like to meet them, all of them. Not interrogate, merely observe. She nodded. Slowly. Very well. We dine at 7:30. I'll ask them to come afterward. When she departed, Holmes remained crouched over the map, his brow furrowed in a frown deeper than the simple act of reading could explain. Something troubles you, I said. He nodded. Many things, Watson. But chiefly this, the layout. See here, beneath the orchard there is a notation. A faint circle marked Old Well, sealed. Did you notice that in the orchard? Number. Nor did I. Which means either it's well hidden, or someone did not want it seen. Before I could reply, the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 7, its deep bell rolling through the silence. We took a brief respite to dress for dinner, though the occasion itself proved somber, taken in a long dining hall dimly lit by candles, with Clara seated at one end and Holmes and I opposite. No one spoke much, and the meal passed like a memory, strangely distant even as it happened. It was shortly after 8 when the household staff assembled in the drawing room as requested. Clara introduced them in turn: Mrs. Barrow, the housekeeper we had already met, Mr. Clegg, the gardener, a bent man with hands like bark and a voice like gravel, Elsie, the young maid with eyes too wide for her small face, and finally, Mr. Trevor, the steward, tall, thin, with an expression of perpetual suspicion. Holmes greeted each warmly, asking only general questions: how long they had worked at Windermere, their memories of Sir Giles, and whether they had ever noticed anything strange about the orchard tree. It was this last inquiry that drew a curious pattern in their answers. Mrs. Barrow sniffed. That tree's always been strange. You can feel it. Like it's listening. Mr. Clegg shook his head. The roots run deep. I've dug all through that orchard but never once managed to move it. I think it'd stay standing if the rest fell down. Elsie said nothing at all, only looked down and twisted her apron. But it was Mr. Trevor who caught Holmes's attention. He hesitated, then said, Sir Giles once told me that tree marked something. Marked. Holmes leaned in slightly. Trevor shrugged. A place or a secret? I don't know. He was drunk when he said it, but he always walked there alone on December nights. Never let anyone follow. And you? Holmes asked. Have you ever followed? Trevor gave a sharp laugh. No, sir. I know when to leave things buried. The remark was offhand, but Holmes's gaze sharpened. And what, Mr. Trevor, do you believe was buried? There was a pause. Then Trevor shook his head. Only what he couldn't carry. Holmes said nothing further but offered a brief nod of thanks. The staff were dismissed soon after, and the room once again grew still. You noticed it, Watson? Holmes asked. I noticed Trevor was nervous. More than nervous, defensive. And young Elsie. The girl said nothing. But did you see her shoes? I blinked. No. Why? Wet, the soles, and the hem of her dress was faintly muddied. Someone has been near the orchard today, though they claimed otherwise. You think she delivered the letter? I think she knows who did, and that knowledge is beginning to weigh. Holmes rose, stretching slowly, his limbs moving with that deliberate grace he possessed in moments of heightened mental focus. There is a strange energy in this house, Watson. It vibrates between guilt and dread. The people here are not liars by nature, but the truth they guard has become ritual, old, inherited. You mean they don't even realize they're hiding something? Precisely. A log shifted in the hearth, cracking softly. The flames flickered higher, casting long shadows along the paneled walls. Holmes moved toward the window and looked out. Tomorrow, we explore the greenhouse and the sealed well. Tonight, I would like you to speak with Elsie. Gently, not as a detective, as a man. There is something she wants to tell. And you. Holmes's eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. I am going to the library. There is a list of landowners tucked away in that book Sir Giles kept. I suspect one of them shares more than a name with the woman in the photograph. As I left in search of the maid, I looked back once at Holmes's figure, silhouetted against the cold pane. The storm outside had passed, but something older remained in the air, a silence that clung to the stone like frost. And beneath it all, I could not shake the feeling that we were no longer simply following a trail of crime. We were entering a memory, one the house itself had never been allowed to forget. Chapter 5. Whispers beneath the stair. I found Elsie in the scullery, folding linens with methodical care. The lamps above flickered weakly, and the room smelled faintly of lavender soap and scorched wool. She did not look up as I approached, but her shoulders stiffened, betraying that she had expected someone to come. "Elsie," I said gently, "might I have a word?" She nodded, eyes still on the folded towel in her hands. "Aye, Doctor." "I'm not here to accuse you of anything," I began. "Only to understand, Mr. Holmes noticed your shoes earlier, mud on the hem, wet soles. It's no crime to walk the orchard. But it would help us if we knew who else had been out there." Her fingers paused in mid-fold. "I didn't go to the tree, sir. Not close. Just walked the edge. I had a feeling." A feeling. She hesitated. "You ever have a place feel like it's looking back at you? Like it's not a place anymore, but a person what remembers what you'd done?" I nodded slowly. "I believe I've stood in such places." She glanced at the doorway, then stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Sir Giles told us not to speak of her. Not ever. He said if we forgot her name, she couldn't come back." "Whose name?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I truly don't. He only called her the first mistake, said she'd never been meant to live here, that the land rejected her." A chill touched my spine. When did he say this? 2 winters ago, after the last time the tree wept. What did he do? He went to the orchard that night with a spade. I saw him from the attic window. He dug near the roots for hours. Then he came in shaking and he burned the old book. "But we found that book in his study," I said. She shivered. "Then he didn't burn the right one." Before I could press further, footsteps sounded down the hall and she stepped quickly away, resuming her folding with practiced ease. It was Mrs. Barrow, arriving with a tin of polish and a suspicious glance. I thanked Elsie and excused myself. Back in the drawing room, I found Holmes seated with a volume open across his lap. His brow was furrowed, and a loose sheaf of notes lay beside him. "She knows something," I said. Holmes looked up. "So do I." He held out a paper, a list of Windermere's previous tenants and landowners, complete with annotations. It seems Sir Giles was more genealogist than gentleman. I scanned the list. Several names meant nothing to me, but one caught my eye. "Agnes Armitage," I read. "Same initials as the locket." Holmes nodded. "Sir Giles's aunt, a scandal attached, unmarried mother, disowned in 1861, child born under uncertain circumstances. The record notes only that both mother and infant died shortly after." "But that can't be the woman in the photo," I said. "The image is far more recent. Indeed, unless the child lived and had a daughter of her own." He flipped the photograph once more under the lamplight. This woman, I believe, is a generation removed from Agnes. Her child, the one standing beside Sir Giles, may be the missing link. But why hide it? Perhaps because that child was never meant to exist. An unacknowledged heir. A consequence of a crime buried beneath layers of inheritance and shame. We cannot know yet. But we can ask, why keep the photograph? Why lock it away with a locket bearing those same initials? I sat beside him, and the sealed letter. Holmes picked it up once more. We hold a box, Watson. Its hinges are creaking. The moment we open it, something long silenced will speak again. At that moment, Clara entered the room. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "Mr. Holmes, Doctor, I need to show you something." She led us up the eastern staircase, the banister cold beneath our hands. At the landing, she stopped before a narrow wooden door I hadn't noticed before. "This used to be locked," she said, "but this morning it stood ajar." The key was still in the lock. Holmes turned it gently and pushed inward. The air inside the small chamber was stale, thick with the scent of cedar and paper. It was a storage room filled with crates, musty trunks, and moth-eaten blankets. But what caught the eye was a framed canvas resting against the far wall. Holmes approached it at once and lifted the cloth that covered it. It was a portrait. A woman stood in a black gown, her hands clasped, her face solemn and pale. But it was not the woman we had seen in the photograph. It was the girl. Grown. "She looks just like Clara," I murmured. Clara shook her head. "I've never seen this before." "She's your cousin," Holmes said softly. "I'd wager it." The lower right corner of the painting bore initials. L.A. Holmes tapped them. Lucinda Armitage, a ghost, hidden in plain sight. I stared at the solemn eyes in the portrait. They bore something familiar. Some quiet accusation that pierced the room's stillness. "What happened to her?" I asked. "That," Holmes said, "is what we're about to find out." He turned to Clara. "I must ask, did your stepfather ever mention a burial on the grounds not recorded in the family registry? Perhaps during your childhood?" Clara faltered. "There was a story, a nursemaid told me once, about a grave under the orchard tree. She was dismissed the next day." Holmes folded his arms. "We need to open that ground, Miss Pendred." She met his gaze. "Then you shall." Outside, the wind was rising again. A hush fell over Windmere Hall, as if the walls were listening. And beneath the floorboards of memory, something old was shifting. Chapter 6. Beneath the roots, the sky was leaden the next morning, veiled in a dull, unbroken grey that pressed down upon the house like a lid. The grounds of Windmere lay in brittle silence, touched by a thin layer of frost that caught the light only faintly, as if the sun itself feared to draw near. Holmes and I rose early, foregoing breakfast and made for the orchard, while the others still stirred indoors. Pendred met us at the base of the back stairs, his greatcoat already buttoned, a spade in hand. "I thought you might ask," he said simply, offering the tool to Holmes. "There's another in the shed." Holmes gave him a rare nod of gratitude. "You still believe nothing unnatural lies beneath?" "I believe memory is the most unnatural thing of all," Pendred replied. "It grows in shapes we can't predict." We made our way out in silence. The orchard, though familiar now, still seemed to resist our presence, as though it bristled against intrusion. The tree in question loomed ahead, blackened and knotted, its limbs sagging like weary arms. A light mist hovered just above the ground, clinging to the bases of the trunks, like an old secret, refusing to rise. Holmes circled the great pine twice before settling on a patch to the left of the gnarled roots. This is it. Disturbed once before, not recently, but within a few years. Someone filled it in too neatly. Pendred fetched the second spade from the shed while I removed my coat and took the first cut into the earth. The ground was firm, but not frozen, yielding slowly with the reluctant sigh of earth long pressed to silence. Holmes joined me after the first few inches, and together we dug in slow, measured rhythm. The first sign came at 8 inches, a scrap of fabric, grey and tattered, clinging to a root like a memory clings to a name. Holmes paused, plucked it loose, and held it up. It was a fragment of linen, hemmed with faint embroidery. L.A. Lucinda Armitage, I said. Holmes gave a single nod. At 11 inches the spade struck wood. We cleared the top layer of soil, revealing the rotted edges of a box no more than 4 feet long. It was not a coffin in the formal sense, just a carpenter's crate, nailed hastily shut. The wood had darkened with age and damp, and in several places it had split open. "Help me," Holmes said softly. We lifted the box with care and laid it on the grass. Holmes removed a pocket knife and pried at the nails. One by one the lid gave way. Inside was the shape of a small girl, no more than 10, wrapped in a decayed shawl. Her bones had long since settled into stillness, but the outline of her braid remained, preserved like the remnant of a thought too heavy to fade. A silver chain rested at her neck, and beneath it, the remnants of a doll's arm. Porcelain, cracked. There was no sign of trauma, no blood, no wound, but something in her posture was wrong. "Folded," Holmes said after a long silence, "folded unnaturally, as if forced to fit." I stepped back, unable to hold the sight any longer. Pendred said nothing. His hand tightened on the handle of the spade, his breath steady despite the cold. Holmes reached into the folds of the shawl and removed a scrap of parchment, remarkably well preserved. It was tucked beside her, he murmured, folded 4 times. He opened it, and we read the words together. She was not named, she was not blessed. She was the mistake of the winter, and must not pass into spring. Forgive me. No signature, only a small symbol scrawled at the bottom, the same eye within a tree. We recovered the girl with reverence, then moved the crate aside. Holmes knelt in the exposed pit and began brushing around the edges with bare fingers. "There's more here," he said suddenly. Beneath, another scraping of metal, another layer disturbed. This time it was not wood but stone, a slab. We cleared the soil carefully until the stone was fully revealed. A flat, rectangular marker, uninscribed save for a faint pattern etched across the top. Holmes leaned closer. "Watson, look." It was a spiral, not unlike the grain of the tree's bark, but within it, barely visible, was the shape of a key. "A family seal?" I asked. "Or a map?" Holmes whispered. "A direction to something else." He stood, brushing dirt from his trousers. "Cover her again, gently. This was no ordinary burial. It was a silencing, one of desperation." Pendred helped me relay the soil. When we were done, the orchard seemed heavier, as though the earth itself had been stirred into remembering. No birds sang. Even the wind fell quiet. Holmes stood motionless for a moment, then turned away from the tree. "We now know she existed," he said, "but we still do not know why she was forgotten." "And the letter?" I asked. He nodded. "The one Clara received was no idle threat. Someone knows the tree's secret, and someone is trying to ensure it is not uncovered, which means they're still watching." We returned to the house in silence, the frost crunching beneath our boots. Inside, Clara met us at the door. She saw our expressions and said nothing, only stepped aside to let us pass. Holmes stopped at the stair. "Miss Pendred," he said quietly, "do you recall anyone visiting Windermere in the spring of your 10th year? A woman, possibly a governess or nursemaid, who arrived suddenly and left without explanation?" Clara frowned. "Yes, there was a woman, dark-haired, quiet. I don't remember her name, but she brought a book with her. A book with strange symbols." "What happened to her?" "She left in the night. My mother said she was ill. I never saw her again." Holmes turned to me. The pattern continues. Every 10 or 15 years, someone remembers, and someone else is sent to forget. And now the forgetting has failed. He looked toward the frost-covered orchard visible through the window. And the tree has begun to weep again. Chapter 7. A mark left in dust. That evening the house pressed tighter around its secrets. Windermere Hall seemed to listen more than breathe. Each corridor echoed faintly, not with footsteps, but with the kind of hush that one associates with ancient monasteries or sealed crypts, a quiet that had long ago forgotten how to speak. Holmes, never one for idle rest when a case hovered in its incomplete state, remained cloistered in the study, poring over genealogical scrolls and Sir Giles's personal correspondences, while I took to the upper rooms, hoping to clear my thoughts with a slow walk through the dimly lit hallways. It was in the north corridor, unused, cold, and lined with dust, that I came upon something peculiar. There, beneath a thin trail of soot blown in through the cracked pane of a high dormer, was the outline of a bare foot. Small, damp, recently made. No accompanying set of prints. Just one, positioned beneath an old portrait hung askew, as if someone had paused to look and then vanished into the wall. I crouched low and studied it. The print had melted a shallow indent in the dust, the toes crisp, the arch narrow, clearly belonging to a child. Yet no children resided in Windermere. I stood abruptly, and the sensation that I was not alone gripped me. The corridor felt colder, the shadows deeper than they should have been, but when I turned, the hallway behind was empty. I returned to the study at once. Holmes did not look up from the map he had drawn across 2 sheets of parchment. "You found something," he said, as though I'd spoken aloud. "A footprint," I said. "Small, bare, north corridor, near the east-facing dormer." His eyes narrowed. "Again?" "That's 3 locations now," I said. "The orchard, the guest room, and now the north wing, all barefooted, all child-sized. And no one claims to have seen the one who leaves them." Holmes tapped his pencil against the parchment. "I've overlaid the house's original foundation beneath Sir Giles's most recent map. Look here. His corridor wasn't part of the initial design. It was added later." "So was the guest wing," I said. "Exactly. What if these additions weren't simply architectural expansions, but attempts to seal something off, redirect the natural path of the house away from a particular point?" I frowned. "You believe the house was reshaped to avoid memory? To obscure it? To break the trail?" Holmes reached into his coat pocket and removed the photograph again, the one of Sir Giles, the unnamed woman, and the child. He laid it beside the map. "Notice the background, the pine, of course, and this stone arch. Look here." He pointed to a barely visible half-circle in the background of the photograph. "That's not in the orchard." "No," he said, "but it was. Before Sir Giles had it removed. The same arch stands now, crumbled and overgrown, behind the old greenhouse. I believe it marks the original entry point to a structure no longer on record. A crypt? I asked. Or a chapel, Holmes said. Sir Giles may have tried to erase it, but the foundations remain. At that moment, Pendred entered, carrying a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. This arrived by post this morning, he said, placing it on the desk. No return address, just the name Pendred inked on the label. Holmes rose instantly and unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay a thin book, hand-bound in dark leather, its pages brittle and smelling faintly of dried sage. Across the first page, in a neat, archaic hand, was the title, Of the Route That Remembers, a record of the winter-bound. Beneath it, an inscription, For the one who saw and stayed silent. You were never meant to sleep peacefully. Holmes turned to the middle pages, scanning quickly, lips moving in near-silent recital. Then he stopped. It's here, he said softly. The ritual, not a spell, no, but a kind of promise. A child born in the season of deepest frost, unnamed, unchristened, buried before the thaw, becomes a vessel for memory, bound not to life or death, but to the land itself. I stared at him. You're saying Lucinda's child was not buried simply as a victim, but as a sentinel? She was never given a name, Holmes said. The note in the grave confirmed that. That act, denying her identity, tied her to the memory of the tree. Each winter, the land remembers her. The weeping tree is not a supernatural event, Watson. It's a biological echo of a buried truth. Water drawn from root to bark, shaped by memory, by grief. Pendred sat heavily beside the hearth. Good God! Holmes closed the book carefully, and someone here is still trying to keep her secret buried. We found her, I said. Isn't that enough? Not if the one who placed her there believes exposure is dangerous. Holmes turned toward the window. You recall what Clara said about the visitor when she was 10? The woman with the book. He tapped the new book with a single finger. I believe this is that book, which means the visitor was not just a governess. She was a steward of knowledge, sent to protect the legacy of the winter-bound child. And someone at Windmere intercepted her. There was a knock at the study door. It was Clara, her face pale. You'd better come quickly, she said. Elsie is missing. We followed her down to the servants' wing. Elsie's room was small, bare, and tidy, but the bed had not been slept in. On the windowsill was a single pressed flower, brittle and dry, a violet coated in frost. And beside it, a note. She called to me. I saw her hands in the frost. She is not angry, just waiting. There was no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakably Elsie's. Holmes folded the note carefully. She's gone to the greenhouse. Why there? I asked. Because memory does not die, Watson. It roots itself, and someone else, something else, is trying to bloom. Outside, the wind began to rise again, soft at first, but rising, as though stirred by a presence walking once more where none should walk. We followed it into the dark. Chapter 8. The Glass That Forgot to Shatter. The greenhouse stood like a skeleton among the weeds. Its frame, once proud and symmetrical, now slouched into the brambles with the fatigue of a long winter. Frost had painted the glass with swirling patterns, some natural, some curiously deliberate. In the dim moonlight, the structure looked not so much ruined as half transformed, its jagged panes catching the light like broken teeth. We approached in silence. Holmes led, his breath fogging the air, followed by Clara and me, with Pendred bringing up the rear. No one spoke. The snow muffled our footfalls, and the wind no longer stirred. Not here. This corner of the estate had a stillness about it, an oppressive quiet that felt not empty, but waiting. Holmes paused just outside the greenhouse door and motioned for us to remain behind him. He produced a small torch and lit it, the warm beam cutting a swath through the veil of grey. The interior was dense with vines, long dead, which curled like skeletal fingers around every beam and arch. "She's inside," Holmes said softly. "How can you be sure?" Clara whispered. He pointed to a set of footprints, bare, delicate and slightly arched, leading directly through the door and onto the gravel-strewn floor inside. They match the ones from the corridor. "But they're too small to be Elsie's," I murmured. "They are not Elsie's," Holmes replied, but she followed them. We entered cautiously, each step sending soft echoes through the cold frame. The remnants of gardening benches lined the walls, and a rusted water pump sat tilted in the corner. Beneath the far end of the greenhouse, where the stone floor dipped slightly into a basin once used for irrigation, Holmes knelt and motioned his light downward. Elsie sat there. She was unharmed, though her eyes were unfocused, as though she had wandered into a story told too quietly and too long. In her lap lay a small object, round, metallic, a button, perhaps, or a token. Clara rushed forward, but Holmes stopped her with a raised hand. "She's awake but not present." Pendred knelt beside her and gently touched her arm. "Elsie." She blinked slowly and turned her head. "She's not angry." "Who?" I asked. "The girl," Elsie murmured. "The one they forgot. She doesn't want revenge, just her name." Holmes took the metal token from her hand and studied it. It was worn, but bore the same spiral symbol etched into the slab we had unearthed in the orchard. Around its edges was a faint engraving in Latin. Memonis arboris, to remember the tree. Holmes turned to Clara. "This greenhouse was built atop something, a foundation older than it. There's an entrance beneath that basin." "How do you know?" she asked. He held up the token. "Because this is a marker, a key, likely ceremonial, placed by someone who understood the rules of remembrance." He examined the floor more closely, running his hand along the edge of the basin. After a moment, he pressed against a narrow crack between two stones, and a click sounded. A panel of floor shifted slightly beneath the weight. Pendred helped Holmes lift it, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. A hush fell over us. I lit a second lantern, and Holmes led the way, descending with a swiftness that betrayed neither fear nor hesitation. The stairs turned sharply after the first few steps, and the air grew damp, thick with the scent of stone and time. The tunnel was narrow, lined with uneven brickwork, and after several paces it opened into a chamber no larger than a parlor. Its walls were covered in ivy, which somehow continued to grow despite the lack of light. In the center stood a pedestal, stone, circular and cracked, upon which rested a box carved of dark wood. Holmes approached, brushing dust from the lid. "No lock," he said, "no hinge, only weight and secrecy." He opened it with care. Inside lay a folded dress, child-sized, pale blue. Beneath it, a book. He lifted the garment first, holding it with reverence. The embroidery on the collar matched that of the linen found in the grave. L.A. Holmes set it aside and opened the book. The pages were stiff with age, the ink faded but legible. It was a journal. "I am Lucinda. I write so I do not forget. They have taken her from me. They say she was born in silence, and so silence she must remain. But she was warm. She breathed. She knew my voice. I named her Alma." Holmes turned the page slowly. "Sir Giles said it must be done for the land." That if we buried her beneath the tree it would forget, but it hasn't. The land remembers, and so do I. The final entry was written in a different hand, sharper, less elegant. The tree weeps, the girl calls, the name was spoken. We must bury the book. Holmes closed it. This journal proves it. The child was born, lived, and was buried without recognition. Lucinda tried to preserve her memory, but someone, likely Sir Giles, overwrote it. First with shame, then with silence. And now, I asked. Now the pattern begins again. Every decade someone hears her. Someone sees the frost form into hands, or the bark cries blood, and someone else silences it. Elsie stirred at last, her voice stronger, but I heard her. I said her name. Holmes turned sharply. You said it aloud. She nodded. Then we are no longer searching for the one who remembered her, he said. We are being hunted by the one who would erase her. Again. We climbed from the chamber and sealed the hidden stair behind us. As we emerged into the pale light of morning, Holmes glanced once more toward the orchard. The tree stood still, but its bark glistened. And beneath one root, just visible from the corner of my eye, a single feathered bloom had broken through the frost, pale blue, like the dress in the box. Chapter 9. The name that was spoken. The dawn broke slow and sullen, wrapped in mist so thick it blurred the edges of Windmere Hall. Snow had fallen during the night, but only lightly. Just enough to blanket the land in a pale hush, as though the world were holding its breath. No footsteps marred the orchard that morning. No birds stirred in the hedgerows. Inside, the fire crackled quietly in the drawing room, though none of us sat close to it. Holmes stood at the window, with the journal in his hands, its brittle pages open to the first entry. Beside him, Clara gazed at the same text with silent intensity, her hands pressed tightly around a steaming cup of tea she had long since forgotten to drink. Alma, she said at last. Holmes looked up. It means soul, she continued. My Latin's poor, but I remember that much. It's a name given in defiance, Holmes said. Lucinda named her daughter not. To preserve her identity, or to keep her soul from vanishing. To name something is to call it into the world. Pendred entered quietly with news. Elsie was resting, unharmed, though she had not spoken since her return to bed. She's shaken, he said, but calm, almost relieved. She has spoken the girl's name, Holmes said. Alma. That act has reopened something buried. The frost, the letters, the footprints. They are responses, not hauntings. Each one is the land answering a call. I nodded, but someone tried to silence that call, again. Exactly, Holmes said. The person who placed the original letter on the windowsill did so to frighten Clara into secrecy. That same person likely sent the second letter by post meant for Pendred. But why warn him? Why now? Pendred frowned. Unless they believed I'd begun to suspect that I might speak. Or that you had seen something, Holmes said. Something they feared you would remember. There was a knock at the front door. We turned at once, instinct tightening our postures. Mrs. Barrow passed through the hall and returned moments later with a man in a brown traveling coat and a scarf drawn high on his face. His hair was grey, his eyes sunken, and his manner was hesitant, but not unfamiliar. Mr. Trevor, Holmes said, we were just discussing you. The steward stepped inside, removing his gloves. His hands trembled slightly. I received this, he said, extending a torn scrap of paper. Holmes took it. The handwriting matched the previous letters, but this one contained only a single line. You knew her name once. You forgot. Speak it, and it will follow you too. Holmes turned the paper over. The back bore a partial fingerprint in some dark, oily substance. "Trevor," Holmes said, "how long have you worked here?" 17 years, and before Windermere. I worked on the Armitage estate in Southwell, Sir Giles's property. I was in his personal service. Holmes nodded slowly. "You knew Lucinda?" "I did," Trevor whispered. "I was a young man then. She was strange, kind, but solitary. Always in the orchard. She never spoke much to anyone but the child." "So the child lived longer than we were told?" Trevor hesitated. "Long enough to learn to walk. Long enough to call her mother." A silence fell over the room. It felt enormous. Holmes leaned forward, and then what happened? There was an argument. Sir Giles came one evening alone. I heard them in the orchard. She begged him not to take the child, said the land had accepted her. He said the land belonged to him, and she would not defile it. Holmes's voice was steel, and he buried her. Trevor lowered his eyes. "He made me help. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought, God help me, I thought the child was already gone. But her hand moved, Mr. Holmes, as we laid her down. It moved." Clara choked back a sound and stepped away, one hand pressed to her mouth. Holmes closed his eyes for a moment, then turned to me. "There are cruelties so profound, Watson. They echo into the very grain of wood, into bark and frost, into roots." Trevor continued, his voice hollow. "Afterward, he made me swear never to speak her name. Said it would awaken her, that she was no longer a girl but a wound." "And Lucinda?" I asked. "She left the next day, or rather, she was taken. A carriage came. No one saw her again." Holmes placed the letter down. "Then this is no longer merely a mystery, but an inheritance, a pattern of forgetting enforced by fear." He turned to Clara. "Miss Pendred, I must ask you something difficult. Have you spoken the name aloud since reading the journal?" Clara nodded faintly. "Once. When I read that page. I whispered it. I didn't think." "You thought correctly," Holmes said, "because now she remembers you." I stiffened. "You mean the child?" "No," Holmes replied. "The one who tried to silence her. They believe the chain is breaking. That remembrance will spread." Clara looked pale. "What does that mean?" Holmes stepped to the window. "It means that they may act again, soon, desperately." He turned, his eyes sharper than I had seen them in days. "I want the grounds searched. Every path, every passage. If someone still walks these halls in fear of Alma's name, then they are close, watching." Pendred rose without a word and left to rouse the groundskeeper. Holmes moved to the hearth, where the fire had nearly died. "Watson," he said, "prepare yourself. We may not be solving a crime that happened. We may be witnessing one about to occur." "And if it does?" I asked quietly. "Then it will no longer be a case of memory," Holmes said, "but of justice." As he spoke, there came a faint tapping at the glass. We turned. In the condensation on the outer pane, drawn by a finger too small to belong to any adult, was a single word: Alma. No footprints lay in the snow below. Only silence. Chapter 10. The silence that followed the name. No one slept that night in Windermere Hall, though the fire was stoked high and the doors were locked. A deep and subtle unease settled into the house like a breath held too long. Every board seemed to creak differently. Every gust of wind through the chimney felt too measured, as though it carried meaning. I sat beside the hearth in the drawing-room, trying to read but unable to concentrate. my ears straining toward every sound beyond the walls. Holmes did not sit. He moved restlessly between rooms, inspecting hinges, locks, and narrow corridors, with the intensity of a man tracking a creature unseen. He carried no lantern, no weapon, only a small roll of paper in his coat pocket, and a thin metal rod he used to tap along the skirting boards, listening for hollow places. Around 2 a.m, he called us to the library. Clara, pale but composed, arrived first, followed by Pendred and Mr. Trevor, who looked older by the hour. Elsie remained upstairs, still weak from her ordeal in the greenhouse, though she had spoken a little, mostly of dreams in which blue dresses bloomed from trees and names grew like roots from the earth. Holmes stood before the tall window, the frost glass pane still bearing the faint outline of a child's writing, though it had begun to melt and run. "She is not vengeful," he said without preamble, "nor is she a ghost. She is something more terrible." Trevor stiffened. "What do you mean, Mr. Holmes?" "She is memory," Holmes said simply. "And memory, when denied too long, becomes hunger." We waited. "She does not seek to harm," he continued, "but she must be acknowledged. And someone in this house, someone still among us, intends to ensure she is buried again, permanently." He withdrew the folded paper from his coat. "This," he said, "is a facsimile I made of the family chart Sir Giles maintained. You'll notice that Lucinda's branch ends in a blank." He turned to Clara. "But you, Miss Pendred, are not Armitage by blood." She blinked. "Number. My mother was Giles's second wife. I'm her daughter by a previous marriage." "Precisely. You are not of the line. Which means the last living blood relative of Lucinda Armitage, Alma's mother, is someone else." He turned to Trevor. The steward took a step back. "I don't—" "Yes, you do," Holmes said gently. "You were in love with her. You followed her when she was sent away. Your records show a sudden leave of absence from the estate in 1872. And then, months later, you return. But you bring with you a young child, one you claimed was your niece." Trevor's voice dropped to a whisper. "She wasn't supposed to survive." "But she did," Holmes said. "And you raised her quietly, away from this place. But eventually she returned." Holmes turned slowly, to serve tea in a quiet house, to dust the corridors, to feel, perhaps without knowing why, drawn to a tree that wept in winter. Silence fell. Clara's breath caught. "Elsie?" Trevor's shoulders sagged. I told myself she'd never find it, that the old story would fade. But when she came here to work, she begged me. She'd seen Windermere in a dream, she said. A house with ivy on the windows and a pond that didn't ripple. I should have said no. Holmes nodded. "You didn't know she would remember, not consciously, but she did. She felt Alma's presence, and when she said her name aloud, she became the final echo. Not Alma's ghost, but her voice, carried forward." Clara sat heavily in a nearby chair. "But then who left the notes? Who broke the bell cord? Who placed the book in the greenhouse?" Holmes's expression darkened. "That is what we must now determine. Because someone else knew all this, and they have been trying, quietly, to erase it again." He walked to the mantel and placed his hand against a low panel in the wall. "Sir Giles," he said, "feared Alma's name. But he also feared something else. What would happen if it spread? That is why he sealed the greenhouse, tore down the chapel, and altered the floor plans. He didn't merely bury a child. He tried to re-engineer the house to forget. But memory isn't wood," I said. "It grows back." Holmes gave me a glance of warm approval. He turned to Pendred. "Have you seen anyone wandering the grounds at night? A figure, perhaps hooded or cloaked?" Pendred frowned. "Only once, weeks ago. I assumed it was a poacher, near the pond." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "The pond?" Trevor shook his head. "It's been frozen for months. Nothing there." Holmes was already moving, coat drawn close, eyes blazing. We followed, hastily bundling against the cold. The night outside had not brightened. It was that strange liminal hour before true dawn when everything appears etched in silver. The orchard was silent, the greenhouse dark. But the pond, half hidden behind a veil of black-stemmed reeds, seemed alive with breathless stillness. Holmes walked its perimeter once, then stopped near a thicket of dead ferns. "Here." He reached down and pulled away a thin mat of dried grass. Beneath it lay a hatch, wooden, moss-covered, and edged in rust. "No one remembers this," he said, "because they were never meant to." Together Pendred and I pried it open. The hinges groaned, and a rush of cold air surged upward. Stairs led down, narrow and damp. Holmes turned to us. "The one who guards this place still walks it, and if I'm right, they have one more move to make before memory becomes history." Then, without hesitation, he descended into the dark. Chapter 11. What the water tried to keep. The staircase descended into damp silence. Stone-walled and narrow, the passage beneath the pond smelled of silt and iron. Holmes led the way, his lantern casting long shadows that danced like memories clawing toward the light. I followed with care, feeling the walls close in with each step. Behind me, Pendred and Clara moved quietly, their breaths audible in the confined chill. Above, the faint creaking of the hatch echoed as Trevor remained behind, watching the surface. The stairway ended at a narrow arch carved directly into the bedrock. Beyond it, a chamber opened, low-ceilinged and circular. Its walls were ringed with alcoves, most of them empty save for mildew and cobwebs. But one, near the rear, held something far more distinct. A statue, or what remained of one. It was child-sized, a stone effigy, half-worn by time, with hands clasped and head bowed. The face had eroded beyond recognition, but there was something unspeakably sad in the posture, as if the figure itself knew it had been hidden too long. At its feet lay withered garlands, dried violets, bits of lace, the remnant of a child's shoe. Holmes approached slowly. "A shrine," he murmured, "crude but unmistakable." "To Alma?" Clara asked. Holmes shook his head. "To silence. This was not built to honor her. It was built to seal her away, to contain the story." Pendred crouched beside the base. "There's something behind it. A recess." Holmes knelt beside him and reached into the shadowed niche. He withdrew a bundle, oilcloth, bound with twine, and carefully waterproofed. Within it lay another book. Not a journal this time, but a ledger. Holmes flipped it open, his brow furrowing. "It's a record," he said. "Not of finances, but of names, women, dates, all connected to the Armitage estate. Many crossed out. One appears again and again." He turned the page and read aloud. "M. Elcott, transferred from Chatham. Observed proximity to frost phenomena. Removed. Sealed under pond crypt. Winter, 1892. He looked up slowly. These weren't servants. They were caretakers, witnesses, people who saw too much, remembered too clearly. Clara took a step back. "You mean they were imprisoned?" "Not all," Holmes said. "Some were sent away, but this one," he gestured to the entry, "was not. She was buried here." He turned to the opposite wall where a heavy iron ring was set into the stone floor. "Help me," I pulled. The slab shifted with a groan, revealing a small cavity beneath. Within it lay bones, not scattered, but curled, knees tucked, arms folded, as if the woman within had died sleeping. Around her neck hung a small copper pendant shaped like a leaf. Holmes closed his eyes. She was the first to say Alma's name aloud, and for that, they erased her. There was a sound then, software behind us. Clara turned and her breath caught. At the far end of the chamber, a figure stood in the archway, not ghostly, not spectral, real Mr. Trevor, but different. He no longer looked tired or remorseful. There was something cold in his face now, a stillness, like ice that has waited too long to crack. "You were never meant to find this," he said. Holmes rose slowly. "You tried to forget her." "I tried to protect her," Trevor replied. "You don't understand. Alma wasn't just a child. She was a reminder. Every year, the land changed. The tree wept. People dreamed things they couldn't explain. Lucinda, she swore the girl heard the thoughts of the house itself." "Thoughts," I echoed. "You believe the child could listen to the estate?" Trevor's eyes gleamed. She remembered the things the land tried to forget. Sir Giles feared her. I feared her. She wasn't a girl by the time she died. She was something else. A vessel. Holmes stepped forward. "She was a child, nothing more. But you allowed your fear to twist what should have been grief." "I buried her," Trevor cried, voice cracking. "I buried them all. The girl, the governess, the others, anyone who whispered her name and refused to let it go. I kept the secret alive because the silence was safer than the truth." Holmes's voice dropped to a razor's edge. "And when the tree began to weep again? When Elsie remembered?" Trevor drew something from his coat, a small flask. Its contents shimmered darkly in the lantern light. "I came to end it. Once and for all. The roots of that tree run to this very chamber. Burn them, salt them, end her." "You'd poison the ground," Pendred said, aghast. "You'd defile a child's resting place." Trevor's hand shook. "She's not resting." "Trevor," Holmes said softly now, "listen to me. Alma is not a threat. She is a memory. All she's ever wanted is to be known. You don't need to silence her. You need to speak her name." Trevor hesitated. For a moment, his hand lowered. The flask trembled, and then a sound. A breath, not ours. A whisper, like a child humming just behind your ear. Trevor's face changed. He dropped the flask, it shattered across the stone. And as the liquid hissed, the statue, forgotten and weathered, cracked down the center. A faint line ran from crown to base. Holmes turned to Clara. "Say it." She blinked. "What?" "Her name." Clara stepped forward. Voice trembling, she said, "Alma." The whisper stopped. And then, just faintly, somewhere far above, the orchard tree creaked. Not from wind, but as if in response. Holmes exhaled. "Now," he said, "she can rest." Chapter 12. When the frost let go. We emerged from the crypt, just as the first pale light of morning spilled across the orchard. The mist had lifted, and the frost, so long unmoving, so stubborn in its refusal to thaw, was finally beginning to recede. Tiny droplets clung to the grass like tears, glistening under the slow promise of daybreak. Above us, the tree stood still, its branches no longer weeping, but at rest, as though it had finally breathed. Holmes was the last to ascend the stair, his face unreadable. He paused before the pond, turning once to look across the white fields, the orchard, the house. Then he closed the hatch and pressed it firmly down, not to seal a secret, but to mark an ending. Trevor had not spoken since the crypt. He stood apart from us now, hunched, his eyes glassy with some emotion too old and too deep for words. When Clara approached him and placed a gloved hand on his arm, he did not flinch. only lowered his head like a man sentenced not by law but by memory. Inside the house was strangely quiet, not fearful, only still, like a room that had been waiting too long for its name to be spoken aloud. We gathered once more in the drawing room. The fire had gone out, but no one moved to rekindle it. Holmes remained standing. He removed the journal from his coat and placed it carefully on the mantelpiece beside the silver locket, the weathered token, and the small broken doll's arm. All had been collected from their hiding places. Now they were no longer artifacts. They were truth. "Alma Armitage," he said softly, "born in silence, buried in frost, remembered at last." Pendred cleared his throat. "What happens now?" Holmes looked to Clara. "That depends on you, Miss Pendred." She met his gaze. She was family. No one will forget her again. Holmes nodded. "Then the curse, if there ever was one, is lifted." I turned to him. "Do you believe it truly was a curse?" He gave a rare smile, number only a grief so deep it shaped the land. A child denied her name, a house contorted to forget her. In the end, not a ghost, but a silence that had waited long enough. Trevor spoke at last. "What do you intend to do with me?" Holmes looked at him for a long moment. "You committed a crime, many perhaps, but not for gain, nor for cruelty. You acted from fear. I will not shield you from what may come, but nor will I condemn you." Trevor sat slowly. "That's more mercy than I deserve." Pendred turned to Clara. "We should mark the grave, a real one." She nodded, "with her name." Holmes lifted the small copper pendant found with the bones. "And this, it belongs there." By midday the ground had thawed just enough to work. We gathered beneath the tree. Holmes, Watson, Clara, Pendred, and Elsie, now recovered and wrapped in a shawl. A stone was placed, modest but permanent, a carving etched in quiet reverence. "Alma Armitage, daughter of Lucinda, remembered." No speeches were made, no prayers spoken, but as the wind moved through the branches, there came the faintest sound, a whisper soft as breath, not sorrowful, not grieving, just peaceful. As we stood there in silence, I turned to Holmes. "There's something I still don't understand." "Yes?" "If Alma had simply wanted to be remembered, why now? Why this year?" Holmes's gaze lingered on the horizon. "Because memory is like the tide, Watson. It recedes for a time, but when it returns, it does so with everything it once held. The house remembered, the land remembered, and Elsie, through dreams or blood or both, heard the name again." I nodded slowly. "And that was enough?" He looked at the tree. "It always is." We returned to London the next morning. The papers would never speak of Alma Armitage. There would be no article, no scandal, no trial. Only a note, in my private journal, locked away in the drawer beside my medical files. But Holmes, he carried her story differently. I would catch him sometimes, months later, staring into a fire or walking slowly through Hyde Park in winter, watching the trees with unreadable eyes. And once, long after Windermere had passed from our thoughts, I found a note tucked into the pages of a casebook. It read, "There are cases which begin with death and end with justice. And there are cases which begin with forgetting and end with a name." S.H. Chapter 13. The Letter That Didn't Fade. It was nearly a week after our return to London when the case of Alma Armitage, which we had believed concluded, stirred once more. The snow in Baker Street had begun to melt, leaving muddy tracks along the curb. I had resumed my medical duties, and Holmes had turned his attention to a string of minor affairs: a stolen ledger from a solicitor in Kensington, a vanished greyhound from Belgravia, each of them almost offensively mundane, in comparison to the haunting symmetry of Windermere. But on a grey morning marked by fog and a heavy post, Mrs. Hudson brought in a letter. It was addressed in a child's hand. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street, London. No return address, no postage, only a faint scent of lavender, and the edges, I noticed, were crisp with frost. Holmes read it silently, then read it again. He passed it to me without a word. She remembers, but not just her name. There were others. Follow the weeping to where the water doesn't move. L. I looked up sharply. L. Holmes nodded, his features tightening. Lucinda. But she died. Or so we assumed. He interrupted. What if we were wrong? What if she wasn't taken, but hidden, like Alma? I stared at the letter again. What does she mean by, where the water doesn't move? Holmes crossed to his desk and opened the case log. The crypt beneath the pond was designed to suppress memory, to trap what the Armitage line feared. But if Alma was not the only one buried by silence, then Windermere may be just one root of a much older tree. I felt the weight of it immediately. The shape of the mystery was changing. Holmes tapped the desk with 2 fingers. Windermere was not the origin, Watson. It was the echo. Just then, Pendred arrived. He looked wind-worn and travel-weary, his boots muddied and his coat dusted with road salt. Holmes rose and greeted him with his usual brisk handshake. I received word, Pendred said, from the Windermere groundskeeper. There's been another weeping. Holmes stiffened. Where? Not the orchard. The east side, near the ruined stone well. I exchanged a look with Holmes. That well wasn't on the most recent map. No, Holmes said. But it appeared faintly on the oldest one Giles tried to obscure. Marked only by an initial, M. M for memory. Holmes's voice was quiet. Or M for Margate. Pendred frowned. The coastal town. Holmes turned sharply toward the bookshelves and pulled out a slim red ledger. The Armitage line once owned land there, an estate known as Holingbrook House, sold off quietly after a fire in 1860, never rebuilt. He flipped through the pages, then stopped. Here, he said, a death recorded without a body, one Marian Elcott, a nursemaid, the same name we found in the hidden ledger beneath the greenhouse. Lucinda's caretaker, I said slowly. She was transferred to Windermere. Or buried, Holmes said. But now... He gestured to the letter. Now someone claims she survived. Or was remembered. Pendred leaned forward. You believe Lucinda is alive? Holmes's answer was careful. Number, I believe her memory is active. Her story was passed on, intentionally or not. The letter was not meant merely to warn. It was an invitation. To where? I asked. Holmes's expression hardened. To where the water doesn't move. There was a pause. Then he straightened. Pack lightly, Watson. We leave tonight. The train to Margate was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Outside, the landscape grew bleaker with every mile, the snow thinning into chalky slush, the hedgerows turned brittle under salt winds. Holmes sat opposite me, hands steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed but alert. He had been silent for most of the journey. When I asked what he expected to find, he answered only, a second wound, deeper than the first. Pendred dozed lightly in the seat beside me, his fingers still clutching a copy of Alma's journal. We arrived at dusk. The town had the washed-out melancholy of every seaside place in winter, shops shuttered, boats tarped and forgotten, wind scraping across flat sand. Holingbrook House, or what remained of it, lay 2 miles inland, at the edge of a copse of birch trees. It was worse than I expected. Not a ruin, but an erasure. Only the foundation remained, stones slick with moss, encircled by a rusting fence that leaned like a half-forgotten boundary between past and present. The central courtyard was nothing but earth now, cracked and frostbitten. And yet, there it was, a single tree, twisted, leaning, bark pale as bone, and at its base the earth was damp. Holmes approached it at once, crouching low to run his fingers along the roots. "She weeps here too," he murmured. "The same secretion, the same timing." Pendred knelt beside him. "But there's no grave." "No," Holmes said, "because this is not where she lies." He rose and looked toward the collapsed well near the tree's edge, an old stone structure, half buried and overgrown, its mouth blackened and rimmed with soot. Holmes stepped toward it, staring into the shadowed opening. And in the echo, we heard it. A drop of water, then another, but no splash, just sound, repeating, slow, measured, like breath. Holmes turned to me. "She's there, Watson." I swallowed. "Lucinda?" "No," he said. "The one who remembers her." Chapter 14. The Depths That Echoed Twice. Holmes knelt at the edge of the ruined well. The stone rim, slick with damp moss and brittle with age, leaned slightly inward as if the weight of years had bowed it toward the dark. Below, the sound of water continued, dripping, steady, but wrong somehow. Not echoing, not splashing. Each drop landed on something softer than stone. Pendred held the lantern high. Its glow barely penetrated the mouth of the shaft, but it revealed just enough. A rope, ancient and frayed, still coiled around a rusted pulley, its end dangling uselessly into the dark. "There's no bucket," Pendred observed quietly. "There never was," Holmes murmured. He turned to me. "Watson, rope and torch. We're going down." I opened my mouth to protest, then saw his expression. It was not reckless. It was not even eager. It was solemn, like a man entering a tomb he had once built in a dream. Pendred and I secured the rope to a nearby beam buried in the collapsed wall of the foundation. Holmes tested the tension with one sharp pull, then tucked the second lantern under his coat and slipped over the edge. The rope groaned, but held. His descent was slow, his boots scraping softly along the inner stone of the well's wall. The rest of us stood frozen, watching the rope unravel into darkness, until it stopped abruptly with a faint grunt. 30 feet, Holmes called up. "There's a chamber." I lowered my own lantern until its beam met the edge of the stone lip, casting a trembling circle of light into the well. Pendred followed Holmes's voice with eyes narrowed in disbelief. Another chamber, hidden beneath the foundation of a house that burned. Holmes's voice echoed faintly upward. "Lower the notebook and the journal, carefully." We complied, binding the 2 volumes, Alma's journal and the Armitage ledger, in a satchel and lowering them down by a second cord. When Holmes signaled they'd arrived, we heard no more for several minutes, just the rhythm of pages turning, of footsteps soft on unseen stone. Then, "You'll want to see this." I glanced at Pendred, and against every instinct and the protests of my knees, I began to descend. The climb was steeper than expected, but the walls, rough with old mortar and roots, offered some support. When my boots touched the chamber floor, Holmes caught my arm to steady me. The air was thick, saturated with the smell of old wood, dried herbs, and something older. Beneath the scent of mold and earth was another fragrance, delicate and misplaced, and earth was another fragrance, delicate and misplaced. Lavender, again. "Where are we?" I asked, panting slightly. Holmes turned, his lantern revealing the chamber in full. It was circular, stone-lined, and remarkably well-preserved. At the center sat a small table, its legs sunken slightly into the damp floor. Upon it rested an open book, leather-bound, the pages scrawled with the same narrow, spidery hand we'd seen in Alma's burial record. But it was the wall behind it that stole my breath. Carved into the stone in painstaking detail were names. Dozens. No dates, no surnames. Just first names, arranged in a spiral. And at the center, newly scratched, barely dry. Elsie. I felt a chill then, not of cold, but of something heavier, like the breath of the dead passing through a locked room. Holmes stepped back. She came here. You mean Lucinda? Number, the one who remembers her. He pointed to the opposite wall, where a faint trail of soot smudged the stone near the floor. A child's handprint. Small. Recent. She was drawn here by the same force that drew Elsie to Windermere. A pattern. A memory passed through blood or dream or voice. I looked at the spiral again. These names, are they all? Forgotten, Holmes said. Buried, erased, but not lost. This chamber is not a prison. It's a ledger, a reckoning. He walked to the book on the table and turned the page. His eyes narrowed. Listen to this. I write now for her, for those they silenced, the ones who lived between breath and forgetting. If you have come, it means you remember. Do not bury the name again. Do not seal the wound. He closed the book gently. This is not Lucinda's handwriting. It's newer. Then who? A sound from above stopped us. Pendred's voice, tight, urgent. There's someone in the woods. Holmes grabbed the rope. Go, he said. Bring the journal. We're not finished. I climbed quickly, the rope biting into my palms. When I emerged, the world had changed. The orchard wind at Windermere had been bitter, the salt air in Margate sharp. But here there was no wind, only stillness, like a breath held just beyond hearing. Pendred stood near the edge of the clearing, one hand on the hilt of a walking stick he had brought more for balance than defense. His face was pale. There, he whispered, pointing between the trees. At first I saw nothing, then movement. A figure, slight and slow, walking barefoot through the birch grove. A woman, her hair grey, her back slightly stooped. Her dress was simple, blue, and her arms hung loosely at her sides. She walked not like a wanderer, but like someone returning to a familiar room after many years. Holmes emerged behind me. He saw her and stopped. Lucinda, he said, not as a guess, but as an invocation. The woman paused. She turned her head, not toward us, toward the well. Her lips moved. One word. Alma. Then she vanished into the trees, not with fear, with release. Holmes lowered the lantern. She waited, he said, all these years, not to be found, but to find a name again, to return it. I turned to him. What do we do now? He looked down the well. We climbed back in. I stared at him. There's something else, I asked. He nodded slowly. Yes, Watson. Something beneath the spiral. And in his voice I heard it. Not curiosity, but grief. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. We descended again into the well. Holmes first, then myself, then Pendred. The rope, now worn from its repeated use, creaked with every shift of weight, and I found myself gripping the stone wall more tightly than I cared to admit. The air was colder than before, as though the presence we had glimpsed, Lucinda, or whatever memory wore her face, had stirred something deeper beneath our feet. Holmes reached the bottom and moved directly to the spiral of names. He traced them with a gloved hand until he reached the center. There, beneath Elsie, he knelt and pressed his palm flat against the stone. It's hollow, he said. A panel, sealed. I crouched beside him. Another chamber? Or a vault, Holmes replied, but not one built to imprison. This feels deliberate. A final layer. He drew his penknife and began carefully chipping at the edge of the stone. The crack widened slowly, revealing a narrow gap. With Pendred's help, we lifted the slab from its recess. The hinges, rusted beyond recognition, gave way with a sharp metallic snap. A cold breath of air rose from below, but it did not smell of rot or damp. It smelled of old paper, wax, and lavender. Holmes dropped into the cavity and disappeared from view. I followed, my boots slipping slightly on the stoned lip. Pendred handed down the lantern, and Holmes raised it. To illuminate the space, it was a small cell, no larger than a closet, lined with wood on every side, a hidden coffin of memory. At its center sat a single object, a box, not stone, not iron, wood, lacquered and sealed with wax. No keyhole, no lock, only a ribbon around the edges, woven with black thread, faded but unbroken. Holmes knelt before it. He did not touch it. "It's been waiting," he said quietly, "longer than Alma. Longer than Windermere." "What is it?" I whispered. He looked at me. "The first remembrance." He reached into his coat and retrieved the spiral-carved token we had taken from the greenhouse. With deliberate care, he laid it on top of the box. The wax shivered, and then the ribbon broke, not torn but released, as if by unseen hands. The lid lifted with a soft groan. Inside were papers, hundreds of them, folded, pressed flat, letters written in many hands, ink faded, pages brittle. Holmes pulled the top sheet and read aloud. "To the one who remembers, we were told to forget her name. We were warned she would return if we did not. But we do remember, all of us. And though we have been silent, we wrote, every year, one letter, one voice, to keep her alive, if only in ink. Her name was Alma. She was not a curse. She was our child. Beneath it, more followed. Dozens from Windermere, others from villages we had never heard of. Chartham, Bardenley, Whitby-on-Tern, women and men alike, all writing letters never sent, all remembering." Pendred knelt, awe dawning on his face. "A covenant." "Yes," Holmes said, "a hidden pact between the forgotten and the refusing to forget. Someone preserved this place not to conceal the truth, but to guard it. This is not a burial site. It's a sanctuary of names." He picked up another letter, written in a firm, graceful hand. "If my daughter ever finds this place, tell her she was never alone. Tell her I heard her name in the frost. Tell her I forgave myself only the day I spoke it aloud. L. Armitage Clara." Holmes looked up. This was Lucinda's true legacy. Not silence, not shame, memory. A network of whispered resistance against a line of men who feared the truth of their daughters. The lantern flickered as Holmes replaced the lid. He did not seal it again. "This must be preserved," he said, "and shared, not in newspapers, not in courtrooms, but through telling, through naming." He stood slowly. Because a name carried in silence is a weight, but a name spoken is a bridge. We climbed back up together, the box in Holmes's arms. Above, night had returned. But the sky had cleared. Stars blinked through branches, and the birch grove swayed gently, as if listening to some quiet lullaby. The wind had resumed singing. Trevor stood at the edge of the trees. He looked different, emptier perhaps, but not hollow. When he saw the box, he did not ask questions. He only stepped aside and whispered. He said, "Thank you." Back at the inn, Holmes placed the box on the table of our rented room. He sat beside it, not reading, not thinking, just being still. I stood at the window, watching the frost return to the glass. One word etched itself across the pane as I watched. "Stay." I turned to Holmes. "Do we?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "No, Watson," he said. She no longer needs us to. Chapter 16. The spiral that led inward morning came with a kind of hush not native to the coast. The sea, just visible from our inn window, was still. A pane of dull pewter stretched to the horizon. Even the gulls had fallen quiet. It was as though the world itself had sensed that something had settled in the night, not solved, not exercised, but laid gently to rest. Holmes had not slept. I found him seated in the corner chair, still facing the sealed box of letters, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. The first light of dawn limned his features in a soft gold wash, making him look older than I was used to seeing. Older and strangely peaceful. I stirred the embers in the hearth. "You're thinking of Alma." "I'm thinking of the spiral," Holmes said quietly. He gestured to the journal, now resting on the table beside the box. The spiral appeared beneath the tree at Windmere, again in the stone crypt, and finally carved into the chamber wall below the well. But it wasn't just a symbol of containment. He tapped the journal. "It's a map." I blinked. "A map to what?" Holmes turned his eyes toward the window, to where memory collapses into silence, and where silence must be interrupted again and again by choice. He rose, stretched slightly, and began pacing. "Each site we've uncovered, Windmere, the greenhouse, the well, even Hollingbrook, was not a single crime scene. They were installations, repetitions, each one an attempt to either seal or safeguard. Memory, and each was marked by a spiral. Why? I answered slowly. Because a spiral turns inward. Exactly, he said. It doesn't trap. It draws. It brings the thinker deeper into what they already know. Whoever created these sanctuaries, Lucinda, Marion Elcott, and others, we now see they understood something profound. That memory, when refused, will not die. It only coils tighter. He walked to the box of letters and opened the lid again. From the pile, he drew a single folded page. The ink was heavier than the rest, the strokes more deliberate. He unfolded it and read aloud. If you are reading this, then you have followed the spiral to its end. But remember, the end is always the center. And at the center of every silence lies a name unspoken. Say it and begin again. Beneath it, no signature, just the now familiar sigil, an eye inside a tree with a spiral at the root. Pendred entered then, brushing snow from his coat. The villagers have begun talking, quietly of course, but a few say they saw her. Lucinda? I asked. He nodded, or someone who looked like her. A woman in a blue shawl, walking near the cliffs at dusk. No one approached her. They said she moved like someone who knew where she was going. Holmes tilted his head. Which direction? South, Pendred said, along the old pilgrimage road. Holmes went still. St. Anselm's Path. I remembered the name. A medieval route, lost to erosion, isn't it? Not entirely, Holmes said. It ends near the ruins of a coastal abbey, buried in a landslide 50 years ago. Pendred frowned. You believe Lucinda went there? I believe, Holmes said, that the spiral led her there. And if we are to understand the full breadth of this mystery, not just Alma, but what Alma represents, we must follow her. We left that morning. The road south of Margate was narrow and crumbling, little more than a bramble-choked path bordered by weather-beaten stones. We passed no one. The air grew colder the farther we went, not by degrees but by memory, as though we were descending into something older than weather. Midday brought us to the edge of a cliff. Below, the sea churned lazily against jagged rock, and above that rock, half buried in the hill, were the remnants of the abbey. Not much remained. A stone arch. A collapsed tower. A narrow entrance partially concealed by vines and frost. Holmes stepped inside without hesitation. The interior was dim, the light filtering through fractured stained glass that painted the floor in pale, broken color. At the far end stood an altar, nothing but a flat slab now, its carvings long, worn, smooth. But beside it, freshly laid, was a circle of frost-covered feathers, and at the center of the circle, a spiral etched in salt. Holmes stared for a long time. Then he knelt. I did not interrupt. When he rose, he turned to us. She made it here. Lucinda, or her inheritor. And this, he gestured to the salt spiral, this was her final act, not concealment, not remembrance, but return. To what? I asked. Holmes's eyes glinted. To the origin of the forgetting. He brushed the salt aside with his gloved hand. Beneath it, carved shallow into the stone, was a single word. Maeve. Pendred spoke it aloud. That's not Alma. No, Holmes said. It's older. I felt the weight of the word settle around us like mist. A name forgotten before Alma, Holmes said. The first. The name they buried not in shame, but in fear. He turned to me. The spiral hasn't ended, Watson. It's opening. Chapter 17. The name carved in bone snow fell in slow spirals as we stood before the word etched in the stone. Maeve, a name we had never heard spoken in relation to Windmere, nor found in any journal or family registry. And yet it rang with a weight I could not explain, as though the syllables themselves carried centuries. Pendred knelt beside the engraving and ran his fingers over the faint grooves, the salt from the spiral still clinging to the edges. Holmes remained silent, not the focused silence of deduction, but something deeper, an attentiveness bordering on reverence. His eyes moved slowly around the ruined abbey, taking in every fallen pillar, every vine-stained wall, every place a name might have once been carved and then erased. It predates Windmere, Holmes said at last, and Hollingbrooke, and even the records that Lucinda kept hidden. This is older. Pendred stood, his breath catching visibly in the cold. But why would she return here? Holmes tapped his fingers against his coat. Because every spiral leads to its beginning. And Maeve, I asked, was the beginning? Holmes turned to me. I believe she was the first to be forgotten, not erased by neglect, but removed, intentionally and thoroughly. He crossed to the edge of the ruined altar and brushed away more salt, revealing another engraving hidden beneath frost, a symbol we had seen before, the eye in the tree. But now, for the first time, the eye was closed. Pendred drew a slow breath. You think there's something beneath us? I think, Holmes said, this abbey was not built to praise. It was built to bury. He paced around the altar, scanning the floor. Then he paused, knelt, and pressed both hands to a section of stone just to the right of the spiral. There was a hollow knock. We looked at one another. Together, Pendred and I helped him shift the slab aside. The stone gave way with a grinding sigh, revealing a narrow passage slanting steeply downward. It smelled not of rot or mold, but something far more sterile, dust, dry and lifeless, like a tomb sealed for too long. Holmes lit his lantern and stepped inside without a word. I followed. Pendred just behind, the silence thickening as we descended. The passage narrowed, forcing us to walk single file, and the walls grew smoother, less like natural stone and more like carved corridors. At last, we emerged into a chamber. It was circular, like the others, but this one had no spirals, no inscriptions, no symbols, only bones, arranged carefully, almost delicately, around a stone dais in the center of the room. Human bones, adult, child, some small enough to be newborn, all unmarked, all unnamed. And upon the dais lay a single object, a carving knife, dulled with time, its wooden handle inlaid with the same closed-eye symbol. Holmes approached slowly, kneeling to examine the surface of the dais. It was covered in faint etchings, names scratched in layer after layer. Some were repeated, some were incomplete. At the center, carved deeper than the rest, Maeve. He placed a hand over it as if shielding the name from the cold. This was the first burial, Holmes said, not of body, but of identity. Pendred stepped beside him. They tried to bury the memory before it could speak. Holmes looked up, and in doing so, created a wound that could not heal. Every Alma, every Lucinda, every forgotten daughter, they were echoes of this first silence. He rose and turned to us. Do you understand now? The weeping trees, the frost, the footprints, they weren't hauntings, they were calls, the land itself trying to repeat the name. I spoke quietly. So what do we do? Holmes studied the room for a long moment. Then he stepped to the edge of the dais and, without ceremony, pulled a piece of chalk from his coat. He wrote, not on paper, not on the stone, but on the wall, Maeve, Armitage, beloved daughter, remembered. The moment he finished the last stroke, the air shifted. Not violently, not with sound. Just a gentle warmth, a sigh. Pendred whispered, "Do you feel that?" Holmes nodded. She has been spoken. That is all she ever wanted. We stood in silence, the lantern flickering gently between the bones, and for the first time I felt no unease, only grief and its echo, acceptance. Holmes turned back toward the passage. Come, Watson. Pendred. We must go. As we ascended the corridor and emerged once more into the ruined Abbey's hall, the snowfall had lightened. The spiral of salt had been scattered by the wind, but the carving in the stone remained. Maeve. Holmes paused at the threshold. She will not weep again. I turned to him. Because we remembered. He shook his head. Because we listened. And with that, we stepped into the morning light. ChatGPT said, Chapter 18, Holmes's Final Reflection. We returned to Baker Street 3 days later. The snow had thawed entirely in London, leaving behind slick pavements and a dull wetness that clung to chimney soot and carriage wheels alike. Life in the capital had resumed its ordinary rhythm. Headlines of political squabbles, train delays, and the dull machinery of city affairs. To anyone watching us disembark from the train at Euston, Holmes and I might have seemed little changed. Two gentlemen travellers returning from the countryside, perhaps after visiting an estate or attending a funeral. In truth, both were correct. It was not until the following evening, as I finished transcribing my notes from our final descent beneath the ruined abbey, that Holmes spoke. He was seated near the fire, his long frame folded into the armchair, like a question mark suspended in smoke. His violin rested untouched beside him. The sealed box of letters, now labelled and stored, sat upon the mantel, next to Alma's journal and the facsimile of the family tree we had traced back to Windermere's foundation. Holmes had refused to return any of it. No institution, he'd said, has proven itself trustworthy with silence. He turned to me then, and I recognized the glint in his eye, not the razor's edge of deduction, but something softer, the rare gleam of reflection. You know, Watson, he said, there are mysteries which unfold like mechanisms, precise, clean, almost elegant, a stolen gem, a misaligned alibi, the the work of intellect. I nodded, and this was not one of them. No, Holmes said. This was a wound. He rose, walking slowly to the window. Outside, the gas lamps flickered on in sequence, illuminating the length of Baker Street like a line of silent sentinels. He watched them for a moment before continuing. Windermere, Hollingbrook, the Abbey at the edge of Margate. They were not separate crimes. They were layers. Every generation laid a stone atop the last, hoping no one would hear the voice still speaking underneath. Alma's voice. Alma's, yes, but also Lucinda's, Marion Elcott's, even Elsie's. Each one a variation on the same theme. Do not forget me. He turned to face me fully now. But the tragedy, Watson, is not that they were forgotten. It is that their remembering was treated as dangerous. I felt that truth settle like a weight on my chest. The Armitage line, Holmes went on, believed they were preserving order. That silence was the natural cost of legacy. Sir Giles did not kill out of cruelty, but out of fear, that a single name could unravel the estate, that a single acknowledgement of pain would mean the inheritance was flawed. He gestured toward the box, and so they engineered forgetting, not by fire or violence alone, but by architecture, altering floor plans, building walls, sealing wells, restructuring the land itself to mislead the memory. But the memory returned, I said. He smiled faintly. It always does, in frost, in footprints, in little girls who dream of names they've never heard. You see, Watson, memory does not rot. It roots. We sat in silence for a while after that. The fire crackled low. I found myself thinking not of crimes, but of those left behind by them. Clara Pendred, who would return to Windermere now as its rightful steward, not just of land, but of story. Of Pendred himself, who had learned that duty could stretch beyond the comfortable domain of philosophy and into the messy soil of truth. And of Elsie, who, Holmes said, had gone home with a journal in her coat pocket, and a name whispered once more in her sleep. Alma. Eventually, I asked, "Do you believe it's truly over?" Holmes considered the question. Then, with the quiet certainty that marked only his deepest convictions, he said, "No." I blinked. "No?" "The spiral never ends," he said. "It simply winds outward again. There will be others, other houses, other names, hidden in walls, etched in frost, and someday someone else will hear them." He turned to the window again. "But that is not failure, Watson. That is the proof that they mattered." He walked to the mantel and reached for the violin at last. As he drew the bow across the strings, a low, mournful note filled the room. Not a dirge, a remembering. And as the music filled the silence of Baker Street, I closed my notebook, placed my pen beside it, and knew this story would not be published. Not in the Strand, not in any paper. Some truths were not meant to be dramatized or dissected. Some truths, like names long buried, were meant only to be spoken. Softly. Once. And never again forgotten.